Module 4, the qualities of effective assessment system. The last module looked at the steps that developers can take to embed continuous improvements within their assessment procedures. This module examines in more details the qualities of a good system of assessment. The characteristic that users look for when choosing assessment is that educators look for when evaluating an assessment system. In other words, the characteristic that make the assessment useful. The four qualities of useful assessments: beneficial consequences, validity, reliability, practicality. The four elements represent in Figure 4.1 represent a broad but by no means universal consensus on the essential qualities that make up useful language assessment systems. I would not wish to downplay the importance of other qualities that have been proposed, such as authenticity, Bachman and Palmer 1996, or absence of bias, Kunan 2004, which are discussed in Module 7. But I would argue that they are reasonably well accounted for within this four quality framework. Presenting the four qualities in Figure 4.1 in the form of a cone with practicality at the base and beneficial consequences at the top is intended to convey something about the relationship between them. Practicality is found at the base because it is necessary condition for all assessment. An impractical assessment will simply not survive for very long, whatever its other distinction. Beneficial consequences that might flow from use of a language assessment are at the apex of the cone because they are the ultimate objective of any assessment system. This hope for consequences may include teaching and learning becoming more effective, opportunities opening up for language learners, and employers finding suitably qualified staff by carry out linguistically demanding tasks. Their position in Figure 4.1 reflects that they are supported by the other qualities. Beneficial consequences are not guaranteed by the represents of the other three qualities, but are very unlikely to follow if an assessment system lacks practicality, reliability, and validity. Movements up the cone also represents increasing controversy. Judging the practicality of an assessment system is a relatively straightforward matter. Its validity and consequences will much more open to dispute. Practicality. Practicality was described by Bachman and Palmer as the difference between the resources that will be required in the development and use of an assessment and the resources that will be available for these activities. It is self-evident that an assessment that lacks resources will not be sustainable. If there is not enough time, equipment, money, or expertise to operate an assessment, it may never be used and certainly will not survive in use for very long. In reality, assessment is always in competition for resources. In any language teaching organization, informal assessment in the classroom has to compete for time and attention with other day-to-day activities. While at the more formal, summative end of the continuum, assessment has to complete for funding with libraries, computers, software, teachers, salaries, and all the other essential requirements of a functioning school, college, or national education system. Where quality assessment is made a priority, resources can often be found by support it. Practicality can be thought about in terms of efficiency. The extent to which the commitment of resources to a system of assessment is justified by the benefits it brings. As in other areas of expenditure, assessment choices involve a complex balancing of benefits and costs. As we have to be sure that the tasks we are using are the most efficient way of obtaining the information we need. Equally, it is important to ensure that all of the activities involved in an assessment, including development, scoring, giving feedback, reporting result, and monitoring quality, are taken into account and that they are carried out as efficiently as possible. Educational managers need to weigh up the gains from investing in assessment against the other demand on their budgets. Teachers need to think about how much of the limited time they have with their students should be spent on assessment, how best to integrate and balance with other activities. Assessment systems cannot and should not continue to be used unless a completing case can be made that the benefits of maintaining them outweigh the cost. It is not easy to find the right balance. Teachers may enthusiastically take up new ideas only to find that they cannot keep up with the additional workload. Or they may resist new forms as assessment because they worry that the new system might involve extra tasks that they cannot fit into their already busy schedules. Often managers underestimate the amount of time and the commitment of resources required to support good quality system and so fail to invest enough. Alternatively, they may overestimate the costs, include that they are prohibitive and fail to invest at all. Many assessment projects fail because planning only allows for the cost of development and not the substantial additional resources need to keep the system going. It can be difficult to persuade managers and policymakers that it is not enough just to be seen to have a test or assessment in place. That it is vital that it should also be useful as a basis for making informed decision about assessments. Making it useful will mean allowing for the ongoing costs involved in maintaining, supporting, and improving it. As with other areas of policy, Good quality assessment often relies on energetic individuals who are prepared to argue for funding, demonstrate the value of good practice, criticize the bad practice, and recognize what is and if is not achievable in their working context. Table 4.1 suggests a list of illustrative practical issues that may constrain an assessment development and therefore need to be taken into account. Bachman and Palmer 2010, Brown 2005, Bach 2009. These are organized in relation to the roles indefinite in Module 2. Judgment about how best to allocate resources usually bring with them disagreements and political controversies. In addition to what he calls resource constraints of the kind represented in Table 4.1. Bach 2009 observes that these are often additional system constraints imposed by established working practices and cultural issues. In some places, performance is traditionally reported in terms of percentages, while in others, teachers tend to use letter grades. Certain approach to assessment and certain item formats are favored in some countries, but rejected in others. Multiple choice questions and standards examinations are well established in Turkey, for example, but are seen as controversial in the Russian Federation, where assessment by teachers using performance assessments in the tradition. It will generally be less continuous to go along with local expectation than to try to take a different direction. Advances in computer technology have made some techniques, such as controlling and timing the delivery of assessment, more practical. They have opened up opportunities to capture more kinds of data, such as how long each assessee takes to respond to each item. However, different software platforms also impose their own limitations. It will not be possible to deliver ideas for innovative task formats if the software lacks the functionality. And some techniques are quality easier to manage on paper. Problems with software or with the logistics of logistic of delivering material to large numbers of assessee by computer have put an unexpected end to many otherwise promising projects. While it is not possible for any assessment to be reliable, valid, or beneficial, it is not sufficiently practical to get off the ground. It is manageable, but that has very little or to recommended in it in terms of other qualities. In fact, such assessments are all too common, as Baker in 1989 rather cynically express it in relation to end of year examinations. All that is necessary is that the exam be difficult or traumatic and have some vague relationship to the course the learners have followed. Very often, in situations where assessment are used, no information is ever collected that would allow users to tell whether they have any of the qualities that might make them useful. It seems to be enough that students answer questions and that grades of scores are awarded, even if nobody can explain what this might actually mean. Reliability, we use various tools every day to measure aspects of the world around us. Clock to measure time, scales for weight, their thermo- thermometers for temperature, and so on. When we use them, we want to know that we can interpret these tools consistently. If the time on your watch was sometimes the same as the clock on the wall and sometimes very different, or if your scales told you that one liter of water weighed 500 grams in the morning and 2 kilograms in the afternoon, you would reasonably conclude that they were flau- flaunty and would not trust that they told you. Of course, many of the tools we do use they are not very accurate, but they are good enough for our purposes. We generally get to meeting on time. We measure out ingredients and cook food at a suitable temperature. Much more precise tools are available, but there is trade-off between precision and cost. Accuracy is expensive. Most people don't mind arriving a little early or late for a meeting and barely notice if the temperature in the room is 1 or 2 deg- degrees warmer or cooler than is displayed on the thermometer. Measurements of time, temperature, or weight involve tangible qualities that most people do not find controversial. Language ability is much more slippery and less certain concept. In most approaches to language assessment, it is assumed that language abilities represent a kind of mental traits or attribute similar to physical traits such as height or weight. We often describe people as having more or less language ability in rather the same way as we describe them as being tall or short. Anyone comparing fluent speakers with learners just beginning to grapple with a language may have little difficulty in accepting this idea. On the other hand, all language learners know that they are better to coping with some situations than others. Those who have studied a language as a an academic subject, a high level often struggle to communicate when they first travel to a country where that language is spoken. Those who learn a language in a country, becoming fluent through interactions with friends and neighbors, may have more difficulty with formal written language. In these circumstances, it is more difficult to judge who has the greater language ability. For this reason, it may make more sense to conceive of many different kinds of language ability, depending on the social purpose for which the language will be used. The development of assessment of language for business or for medical or academic of other specific purposes reflects this point of view. In any case, it has to be acknowledged that we are simply not in a position to measure language abilities with the same precision that we can achieve for weight or temperature. Even the very best language assessment cannot come close to the consistency and accuracy of watches or scales. It is inevitable that the estimation of language abilities will involve substantial, unnecessary, or measurement error. The best we can do is to estimate the impact of this upon the scores we obtain. And there are established statistical tools that allow us to do just that. Regrettably, users of assessment results often fail to understand the implication of measurement error. They often overlook or ignore it. If a student has scored 60 points on the language test and student B has scored 52, users may assume that this is concrete evidence that student has greater ability than student B. As this section will illustrate, however, this is not necessarily a reasonable assumption at all. There are several potential resources of measurement error and each affects the degree of confidence we can place in the accuracy of results. These resources of error include measurement using different tools, measurement on different occasions, measurement of different groups of assessees, and measurement by different individuals. If they have reasonable estimates of the amount of error and understand how to interpret this information, users can gain a sense of how accurate scores and grades might be as indication of the assessees' abilities. Without this information, they can only guess. Measurement using different tools, consistency. Just as some tape measures or scales are more accurate than others, there can be little doubt, but language assessment can also be more or less accurate. Also, unlike tape measures, assessments are usually more accurate along a certain limited stretch of the range of ability than at points above or below this. It is as true a tape measures could gauge distance between 40 and 60 centimeters quite precisely. Mhm. But could only provide fuzzy estimate of about 25 centimeter or 30 centimeter or at least 80 centimeter for distance outside this range. A complicating factors is that we have no dependable yard tricks to help us judge just how accurate our language assessment are. If our watches show different times, we can check them against a world clock on the internet. If our weight scales degree, we can use a standard way to check this accurate. Sadly, there is no generally accepted gold standards measure of language ability. When they measure exactly the same qualities, we can translate results between different measurement scale by applying a simple calculation. Kilograms to pounds in weight. Fahrenheit to Celsius in temperature. In contrast to weight or temperature, the concept of language ability itself is understood in rather different ways by individual teachers or test developers, according to their abilities and intentions. Teachers may use different assessment method in different combination to measure abilities and arrive at grades. Translating from one respective to other may not always be possible, and this cause obvious difficulties for the user's assessment results. Content sampling rather. Even where two assessment are intended to measure the same knowledge, skills or abilities are built to exactly the same specification and are administered to the same people at the same time. In other words, where two forms of the same assessment are combined, there will be difference in the results. This is because each firm can only deal with a very limited section of the language to be assessed. And it is a matter of chance how far the sample that is chosen matches its learners' limited knowledge. To illustrate sampling issues, let's say a teacher give class a group of 20 students, an informal test or quiz based on 1,000 words they are supposed to have learned. To check whether the students know the words, leaving aside the tricky question of what it actually means to know a word. He could give them a quiz made up of 1,000 questions. 1 point is available to each correct response. If all the students perform to the best of their ability and manage to stay awake, this quiz would show the teacher exactly which of the words each student knows. But it would also take too much time and mindful of the need for practicality and efficiency. He might decide that a quick 10-item quiz based on random selection of the words should be enough to tell him which students no, now know most of the words and which do not. In fact, although the teacher doesn't know this, each student has learned a random section of exactly half of the words. In this scenario, taking the quiz is rather like asking each student in the class to flip to a coin 10 times, as each student effectively has a 50% chance of knowing each of the words on the quiz. As all students know 50% for the words, you might expect most of them to get 5 questions right out of the 10. But if you flip your coin 10 times, it's not particularly likely that you got 5 heads. Only about 25% or 1 if in 4 people get these results. Most people, 66% or 2/3, will find they get 4, 5 or 6 heads. So for most of Class A, the scores of 4, 5, or 6 do really reflect the way knows about half of the words. According to the laws of probability, however, there is a good chance that one or two students might score 7 points and one or two might score 3 points. There is also a good chance that at least one could be very lucky or very unlucky. In this sample of words on the quiz, there is about a 4% chance, just less than in 1 in 20, that a student who knows about 500 of the 1,000 words would actually score 8 out of 10, and a similar chance that one would score 2 out of 10. It wouldn't be astonishing if one scored 10 or 0. Now let's imagine the teacher gives the same quiz to a second group of 20 students. Class B, but in this group, each student only knows 250 of the words. Based on probability, each student in this class has roughly a 25% chance of success on each question. So we should expect just over half, 53% or 11 of the students to score their 2 or 3. On the other hand, we could expect 4 or 5 students to get a score of at least 4 out of 10, and there is a fair chance that one student might be able to score 6 or more. If the teacher decides to recognize his classes on the basis of this quiz, placing those scoring 3 or below into a lower level and those scoring 4 or above into a higher level class, we would expect to see around 7 of the 40 students going into the wrong class. Even if we increase the distance in the probability of success in the different groups, let's say that in Class A plus students all know 750 words, there are still likely to be learners in Class B who will perform at least as well on the quiz as the lowest scores in Class A plus, simply because of the choice of the words on the quiz. Happily for the teacher, there are ways to improve reliability. One is to increase the number of questions. Of course, 1,000 questions would make the picture very clear, but even 100 questions would be enough to minimize the probability that members of Class A might be confused with members of Class B. It's unlikely but not impossible. Confused with member that anybody in Class A would score less or that anybody is Class B would score more than 35 out of 100. On the other hand, taking a representative sample of the full range of language abilities is usually when every effort is made to examine quality. Precision is very difficult, time-consuming, and costly to achieve. Measurement on different occasions. Stability. A problem when trying to measure people's physical characteristics like height, weight, and foot size in that these can fluctuate significantly. By late evening, people may be as much as 2 centimeters shorter than when they wake up in the morning. Mental abilities also fluctuate being infected by the time of day and physical conditions. Performance on tasks of all kinds is affected by alertness, health, and mood. This means that even if we were able to administer identical and perfectly accurate language assessment on different occasions, without learners recalling the answer they gave the first time around, we should still see difference in the learners' scores on each occasion. And it's not only people abilities that chance over time. If we don't very carefully control the conditions on each occasions that would mister an assessment. The experience may be very consistent. Uncomfortable heat and traffic noise might make the afternoon's listening test session more difficult than the mornings when it was cool and quiet. If the teacher or class K allows her student 10 minutes longer to complete their writing assessment than was allowed for students in class J, they may produce better work even though they have the same level of ability in writing. Holding conditions constant can help to make results more reliable, but it can also be very limiting. Using this strictly controlled task for assessment in class can rule out the use of more creative, unpredictable task type and restrict the role of the teacher to that of invigilator. Prevent from taking formative opportunities to investigate students' difficulties or to help them learn from and improve on the performance. In reality, when tasks are used by teachers, there will inevitably be a good deal of variability in conditions. Balancing the negative effects, months teachers generally have numerous chances to observe that students can do. This means that they gather far more evidence of students' abilities than would be available from most tests. It has been argued that this broad sample of an assessee's abilities may offset the limited reliability of the individual assessment tasks made by teachers. Black and William, 2006. Measurement of different individuals. Test taker characteristics. Differences in performance over time are closely related to the personal attributes of assessees. What Bachman and Palmer called assessees characteristics. These were divided by O'Sullivan and Green, 2011, into three categories: physical, psychological, sociological, and experimental. Physical psychological characteristics include, along with short-term illnesses and injuries, longer-term disabilities that might impact upon test performance, such as poor eyesight causing difficulty in reading the test materials, and stable biological characteristics such as gender. Psychological characteristics also include relatively short-term issues such as concentration and mood, together with more stable characteristics such as personality type. These characteristics can play a major part in performance on assessments. For example, some individuals suffer from such debilitating anxiety when taking tests that they may be unable to participate, while others seem to respond very positively to test conditions. Every effort should be made to put assessees at their ease so that they are all able to perform to the best of their ability. Psychological, physical, psychological. In table 4.2, the experimental characteristics include language background. Speakers of different language encounter different kinds of individuality when learning targets language, and educational experiences such as experience of learning language or previous practice with a certain types of assessment. General knowledge is also likely to contribute to performance. Knowing something about the topic of a recording might help us assessee to perform well on listening tests. Learners with little experiment of using a language of communication will struggle to respond to a self-assessment questionnaire based on real-world language use. For example, assessees will find it much easier to respond yes or no to a statement on a self-assessment questionnaire such as I can make a compliant about simple matters. For example, the light in my room doesn't work. Association of Language Tester is in Europe, 2002. If they have experience of similar situations, contrasting groups of assessees Men and women, adults and children, may have different amounts and different kinds of knowledge about the world. Differences between assessees affects estimates of the reliability of measurement. When assessments are administered to more homogeneous groups, they produce more reliable results. When different population or assessees are involved with different areas of strength or weakness, it is not so straightforward to rank them, and results tend to be less consistent. In an assessment that includes the use of articles in English, A and D, for example, if all the test takers are speakers of French or Spanish, language that have article systems, the results are likely to be more consistent than the French and Spanish test takers are joined by speakers of Turkish and Russian. Speakers of language that do not have article system. Generally, low-scoring French assessees may perform rather well on the questions involved article, while otherwise high-scoring Turkish assessees might perform relatively poorly on the same questions. Some difference in performance associated with test taker characteristic may actually be relevant on the decisions that test users wish to make. For example, a Japanese learner of Chinese is likely to have an advantage over a Thai learners in a reading test because the Japanese writing system is based on Chinese characters, but the Thai is not. However, this advance also applies in the real world. Japanese people can read and understand many signs written in Chinese without speaking the language. The test simply reflects this natural advantage. Other characteristics may affect performance on an assessment, but not affect performance in the real world. This will distort the picture given of real world's abilities. It has sometimes been found, for example, that teenager boys tend to perform a little between when grades are based one of tests that use multiple choices question, while girls perform better when grades are based on the regular homework exercises. Marpy 1982. A multiple choice test may tend to advantage boys, but real life language use does not usually involve choosing answers A, B, or C, and so the purpose of the assessment limiting the range of the formats used for assessment to multiple choice question may therefore introduce a small but systematic bias in favor of boys as a group, but the advance will not necessarily apply every individual. Measurement by different individuals, scorer and rater reliability. Just as individual assessees perform inconsistency, so individual scores may award different numbers of points to the same performance. All scoring process involve a degree of interpretation, uncertainty, and inaccuracy. However, the form of score reliability that attracts the most attention in rater reliability. when scoring involved the judgment to extended constructed responses. If 10 teachers or raters as scores of extend performance response are known, are all asked to judge the same performance, it is extremely unlikely that they will all award it the same score. When the aspect of the variation between the scores they award is at issue. This is inter-rater reliability, even when the same person judged the same piece of work on two different occasions. The score awarded can change sustainably. The extent of this variation is a matter of intra-rater reliability. Perhaps the earliest statistical study on the inconsistencies among raters was carried out by the British statistician Edgeworth 1890. He published a short composition written in Latin and invented qualified examiners to score it on a scale of 1 to 100 as thought it had been written of the prestigious Indian Civil Service examination. He received 28 responses. The number of scores awarded at different levels is shown in figure 4.2. Two examiners thought the composition worthy of the full 100 marks, but one scores it as low as 45 and three others also gave failing scores of less than 70. Edgeworth 1890 concluded that I find the element of chance in this public examination to be such that only a fraction, from a third to two-thirds, of the successful candidates can be regarded as quite safe, above the danger of coming out unsuccessful in a different set of equally competent judges had happened to be appointed. You might like to try a similar experiment to discover whether the situation has improved since 1890. Happily, it is impossible to train routers to be more consistent. This usually done through standardization sessions. In a type standardization session for an interview test, a group of aspiring routers is shown several video recording simplifying different scores level and covering the full range of the rating scale. The routers look at previously rated interviews, discuss the rating skills and criteria with the developers, and try to adjust their own interpretation of the scale until they feel they can consistently match the predetermined official scores. The trainees are done as to work independently to rate more recordings of interviews. The rating are compared with the official scores for those interviews. If the new routers consistently agree with the official scores, they are allowed to work as routers on the assessment. If they do not achieve become consistent or do not achieve consistent agreement. They are deeper given further training until they become consistent or they are rejected. When scoring operational tests or writing or speaking, it is generally recommended that the least two judge should rate each performance independently without seeing each other's score, and their score should be average. If the two scores differ by more than one hand on the rating scale, a third independent rater should be used, and the two closest scores of the three should be treated as the final score. Even where extensive training is given over time, idiosyncrasies in rating behavior tend by recur. Reti- Retraining should be carried out before each round of scoring, and constant monitoring is needed to check that raters remain in line with the intended standards. One way of the monitoring raters would be the include some previously rated raters match the official scores on most of all of these. The same training procedures can be used regularly to encourage teachers to grade learners against comparable standards in their classroom assessments. Of course, teachers who fail to achieve consistency cannot usually be excluded in the same way as test raters, but they can be given ongoing trainings rather. Just a double rating should be used in large-scale testing. Grading decisions should be moderated by other teachers to ensure fairness. Example of written work of recording of performance should be given to the other teachers to rate, independent against this shared criteria. Where disagreements occur, further rating should be carried out. If a teacher is consistently harsher or more lenient in their gradings, decisions that his or her colleague's grade should be adjusted accordingly before they are announced to the assessees. There are statistical techniques such as multifaceted rush analysis that can be used to make this kind of adjustment. 7 ways to build reliability into assessment design. The following suggestions are based on Hughes 2003, Brown 2005, and Douglas 2010. Number 1 is make tasks clear and unambiguous. If the assessment is well laid out and clearly explained so that assessees can all see exactly what they need to do, there is a better chance that their performance will actually reflect the intended language abilities. If instructions are not clearly to everyone, that is not a problem with the assessees but with the assessment, which need to be improved. 2 is and more tasks or more assessments. If you ask one question, a, a weak assessee may get lucky and give a correct answer. If you ask more questions, luck will be less of a factors and a consistent picture of the assessee's abilities is more likely to emerge. The more often you observe a student during a course, the more likely it is that you will get a reasonable sense of where his or her strengths and weakness lie. Number three is limit the scope of what you assess. A grammar test with only one format will be more reliable than a test involving a range of language skill and abilities with multiple formats. However, this will also limit what can be learned about the assessee's abilities. Four is standardize the conditions. Results will be more consistent if the conditions are the same of everyone. Although there may be good arguments in favor of offering choices to assessees or giving some assessees more time, offering choices to assessees of giving some assessees more time than others. Such variation in conditions will reduce reliability. Number five is controlling how the assessment is scored. Providing clear and comprehensive answer keys, unambiguous rating scales, and trainings for scores or raters are all likely to lead to more consistent results. And number six is add more scores, raters, and performance. If two people scores an assessment and the item scores are compared, errors can easily be identified and dealt with. If two scores are or raters scores performance, their disagreement can be salted through a third opinion. The outcomes is much more likely to be a fair reflection of the assessee's abilities. And the number seven is assess learners with a wide range of ability. It is much easier to tell the difference between a craving made by an expert master craftsman and one made by a beginner and than to choose between two pieces made by experts. In the same way, it is relatively easy to build an assessment than reliability distinguish between very high and very low ability language users if all the assessees are at roughly the same level. Estimates or reliability are likely to be lower. Validity. It is important for all kinds of language assessment to be reliable. A learner told by one teacher can she had clear native like pronunciation would like confuse and misled in her next teacher commented that her strong accent made her speech almost unintelligible and recommended remedial training. An employer who recruit two trainees with identical scores on an interview test would lose confidence in the test if one trainee arriving for work seemed to be fluent in the language and the other incapable of connected speech. However, consistency of result is not a guarantee of their quality. Experience tells us that it is possible to be consistently wrong. Defining validity. Validity is often seen as the essential quality of good assessment. According to the classic definition cited in language testing handbooks such as Davis 1990, Hughes 2003, and Brown 2005, a test can be considered valid when it really measures that it supports to measure. When to be explained that ensuring the validity of a test involve securing a close correspondence between test results and practical life. The test results are more comparable to life's results the more practical life. Test results is more comparable life results the more nearly the test process approaches the character of the life process. If the steps that the assessee has to go through to obtain a high score in the test closely match the process that language users go through when carrying out tasks in real life, the assessment accurately represent relevant features of the assessee's knowledge, skill, or abilities, and so much be valid. The connection between tests and real life abilities. Inte- I identified by MC Call remains central in modern ideas about validity, but his definition is now seen to be too limited and somewhat misleading. A more current and comprehensive definition is given in the 1999 Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. Validity refers to the degree to which evidence and theory support the interpretation of test scores essential by supposed uses of tests. American Educational Research Association at all. This definition is not as straightforward, but importantly, it recognizes that there can be no such thing as a valid assessment. Validity is not properly true of a quality of assessments. Quality of assessment at all. But it is a quality of the interpretation that users make of assessment results. An assessment can only be considered valid for a certain purpose. The value of an assessment that is intended to inform one kind of decision and adequately measures what it supports to measure for that suppose may be fatally undermined if results are interpreted to support a different kind of decision. A further problem with MC Call's 1922 classic definition of validity is that it implies a binary yes-no kind of distinction. Results are either valid or invalid, but valid is better seen as a matter of degree. Inferences may be more valid for one kind of decision or for one population of assessees than for another. It follows that when evidence shows that the results of an assessment are valid to suppose a decision about one assessee on one occasion. We cannot simply assume that they will be equally valid for support similar decisions taken about different assessees or decisions taken on other occasions. The process of collecting evidence of the validity of inferences based on assessment results is known as validation. Many different approaches can be taken to validation, but the approach adopted should shed light on the conclusion that we wish to make about learners when using the assessment, ensuring that evidence and theory will support the interpretation of test scores entailed by supposed uses of tests must begin in the design phase. When designing an assessment, we have seen that the first step should be to define and agree on what knowledge, skills, or abilities are to be assessed in order to inform decisions about assessees. The point has already been made that knowledge, skills, and abilities cannot be directly observed and measured in the same way as physical characteristics such as height or weight. However, it is generally assumed that they can be described either as attributes of the individual human mind of or as products of human societies, and that they are variable. Some people have more of these attributes and others have less. For the purpose of assessment, abstract conception of kind of are known as psychological constructs. If we make claims such as your grandmother is the best cook in the neighborhood, we are implying that the possesses more of some underlying capacity or trait of cooking ability than the rest of us. But what exactly do we mean by cooking ability? Is my understanding of the concept the same as yours? How could I prove when truth of the claim that your grandmother is the best? Is the best cook is the same ability needed by prepare a good Chinese food as is required to prepare good Brazilian food or good Russian food. Do savory dishes require the same abilities as sweet dishes? By the same token, different uses of language may involve different forms of language ability. Bachman and Palmer suggest that designers need to define language ability in a way that is appropriate for each particular assessment situation. Depending on the purpose for our assessment, there are many language related constructs we might be interested in measuring. This could range from a very broad overall language proficiency or reading comprehension to reading for geese. Reading for details or something as aspect as the ability of a language learner to ask and answer questions about personal details such as where he she lives, people he she knows, and things he she has. Council of Europe 2001. Different kind of validity evidence can be used To shed light on the value of assessment results, the following section provide a brief introduction to this. Content validity. If we are going to use the result from an assessment, we should be stratify the performance on the assessment will really require the targeted knowledge, skills or abilities, and that the balance made between components in the assessment will provide a sound basis for the specific decisions that will be made about the assessees. All Ideally, the material included in an assessment should represent the full range of knowledge, skills, or abilities that the assessment is intended to cover. Unfortunately, like is not usually that simple. It really isn't possible for any assessment to cover the full range of content that it might be desirable to assess. Limitations on the time available and on the methods that it is feasible to be used to administer the and score the assessment mean well there will always be construct under representation. This limitation suggests that developers can generally only include a very small fraction or the range of knowledge, skills, and abilities that they are interested in. Perhaps the best they can hope for, as Hughes suggested, it is to sample widely and unpredictably to assess as wide a range of learners and teachers cannot force the what is likely to be assessed and then concentrate on learning only that relatively narrow area of content. Regrettably, sampling wide and unpredictably may have a negative effect on reliability, as assessees taking different forms of the assessment will be represented with different content. Developing assessment always involves balancing considerations and making difficult choices, bearing in mind the practical limits on how much material can or should be assessed. Thus should be carefully chosen to ensure that a sufficient range is included. Indications of how far this has been achieved serve as evidence for content validity. These key resources of content validity evidence are view of assessment material. Content validation can and should be carried out before assessment is put into operation through evaluation of the design, assess statement, and specifications. Experts in the knowledge, skills, or abilities being assessed may be consulted on the content of the assessment. They evaluate how adequately they believe the terms assess the intended knowledge, skills, or abilities, and how comprehensively they cover this. Once the assessment becomes operational, routine checks need to be made to ensure the form of the assessment have adequate content validity. Does the material assess the intended contrast and reflect the specifications. Another form of the validity often mentioned in language assessment handbooks is validity. This is very similar to content validity, but the judgments are made by non-experts. Assessees represent employers. The distinction between the two therefore rests on the potentially controversial issues of who should be recognized as an expert judge. Members of the stakeholder groups listed above are not re- recognized by measure specialists as experts with well-informed insights into linguistic theory. This means that face validity is not regarded as a genuine source of validity evidence. In practice, the reactions of stakeholders certainly do have to be taken into account, if only a system constraints that restrict the designer's freedom of choice. If learners, employers, and others do not believe that an assessment is credible, that is that it provides useful information, they may fail to take it seriously or reject it altogether. Creation related validity. While evidence about the content of an assessment can be collected before it is ever used, other kind of validity evidence only become available once results have been obtained from assessees. When test developers first began to talk about validity in the early years of the 28th century, they were usually referring to the relationship between the result of the assessment and some alternative indicators of the same learner's knowledge, skills, or abilities such as teacher judgment or results from other assessment of recognized validity. As a criterion measure. This is what would have be termed criterion-related validity. An assessment is said to have criterion-related validity is the result from the assessment and from the criterion measures correspond to each other. If assessees are ranked from the highest scoring to the lowest scoring, the other will be the same on the assessment and on the criterion measures. Two different kinds of criterion-related validity can be distinguished. One involves comparing results on the assessment being validated with other indicators of the assessee's current state of ability. Test scores might be validated through comparison with teachers' grades from one teacher might be compared with grades awarded by others. This is known as concurrent validity. Predictive validity, on the other hand, involves the comparison of assessment results with how well the assessees perform on the criterion measure some time after the assessment has been given. This shows how useful the assessment is as a forecasting device, telling users how assessees might get along in their future roles. Examples include validation of a proficiency test through comparing result with judgment or of job performance after applicants have then accepted the academic performance of students studying subjects in a validation of a placement test by comparing scores with teacher evaluation after students have spent some time in their classes. Both, both concurrent and predictive validity have some serious limitations. There are practical difficulties of classroom teachers in particular in gaining access to suitable criterion measures. Concurrent validation is dependent on the quality of the criterion measure. Scores on different assessment may be very similar, suggest that both are measuring the same thing, but this is no assessment are often intended to measure rather different knowledge, skill or abilities that the old assessment. So very close matches are not really desirable. If the level of agreements is low, it is unclear whether it is the new assessment on the criterion measures that better captures the learner's abilities. With predictive validation, the trouble is that people scrolling below a certain level do not often get admitted to the course of CAP for the job to which the assessment relates. Although people achieving passing grades may perform well, there is no evidence about those who failed. Perhaps they would have performed just as well or better given the chance. Once accepted for a course or job, people may perform poorly for reasons unconnected to their language abilities, health, finance, family problem, and so on. It is often just not possible to track the performance of learners after they have left a school. This difficult means that relationship between assessment results and later performance are usually found to be very weak. Construct validity. It is fundamental requirements for the effective operation of any assessment system that everybody involved in interpreting assessment results shared list at least a basic understanding of the construct or construct involved. It could be this It could be disastrous if a test developer build a test intended to establish whether or not a learner has the language skill necessary to hold a conversation about everyday topics such as entertainment and travel. But an employer interprets the result to mean that the learner is ready to work in a field where knowledge of specialist language is essential. As a nurse, for example, participating in surgical operation or as an air traffic controller with responsibility for the safety of passengers. Evidence for the validity or the content of an assessment and for its relationship the criterion measures can both help to inform an overall judgment about how well an assessee's performance truly reflects their knowledge, skills, or abilities, and whether the information provided by the assessment is relevant and adequate to support the intended decision. Ultimately, this is evidence that the theory underpinning the assessment, the contrast, provides a sound basis of the decision. Contrast validity is therefore seen as embracing all forms of validity evidence. One well-established approach to collecting contrast validation evidence is the multi-trait, multi-method approach. Cam- Campbell and Fish 1958 59 rather. The validator sets out to discover whether results from the assessment under investigation, assessment X, are similar to results on other assessment Y that uses different task types but address the same knowledge, skills, or abilities. This is a variation on concurrent validity, sometimes called convergent validity. At the same time, results on other assessments that you use the same task type as assessment X but assess different knowledge, skill, or abilities about rank the assessees in a different order, divergent validity. An application of the multi-trait, multi-method approach in language test validation is the Bachman comparison between the Cambridge First Certificate in English and the test of English as foreign language. Over recent years, com- complementing statistical approaches such as multi-trait, multi-method, and has been increasing interest in other ways to explore whether the knowledge, skills, or abilities that are involved when tracal assessment tasks are the knowledge, skill, or abilities intended by the developers. This has been called cognitive validity. One carry out One approach to cognitive validation is to ask the assessees about how they carry out tasks. This is often done using verbal protocol methods that involve assessees reporting on how they found a current answer or how they decided on the content and structure of an essay. See, for example, it is also possible to observe how assessees perform by analyzing their behavior. Insights have been gained into how reader responds to comprehension question by recording their eye movements and tracking where they direct their attention while they read, or by recording each keystroke when they compose their responses to assessment tasks on a computer. Inter Interpretive arguments assessing the evidence. McNamara 2000 explains that the process of validation is now often like to a trial in a law court. In trials in many countries, lawyers of each side in the case represent a version of evidence, and the judge of jury members make a decision about which seems more plausible. Similarly, the users are assessment results, or those holding them to account. need to weigh up the evidence and judge whether an assessment provide a suitable basis for their decisions. Unlike in a court of law, however, the case is never considered closed. More arguments can always be made and new evidence so there is always scope to improve the quality of the assessment. The process of weighting evidence can be conceived as a series of what Kane et al. 1999 call influential bridge link in a chain of arguments connecting test performance with practical life, and so justifying or challenging the use of the assessment as a means of gathering evidence to support a decision. The steps of bridge in the interpretive assessment use argument are set out in Figure 4.3 and Table 4.3 as a series of claims that a test user would want to be able to make about an assessee on the basis of performance on the assessment. Range against these claims are credible alternative explanation for the result or potential rebuttals of the claims. Test users and validators need to explore different explanations for an assessee's performance, including both those explanations that support the intended interpretation and those that do not. Assessment as maps. For communicating about the world around us, assessment have been compared to maps. Like maps, different approaches and formats for assessment are suited to different purpose and must be carefully chosen. A map that is very helpful for one suppose may be quite useful for another. An inexpensive, detailed map is not always the one that best suits our needs. Practical maps often have to be quite limited in size. Designers must be selective in choosing which features of display so that the paper of screen will not be overcrowded and unreadable. Clear representation of one set of features such as roads may involve taking away other features such as hills and forests. Walking maps provide a lot of detail, but can convey only a small area. This may make it easier to follow a walking route, but more difficult to locate places of interest. Useful transport maps showing bus or train roads tell us the names of the stops, but do not accurately represent by physical distances between them and give no information about the landscape. When we buy a map, we choose one or a combination of different maps that is likely to give us the information and level or details we need and no more. Like map makers working with a small screen display, assessment designers only have a limited opportunity to build up a picture of an assessee's abilities. They need to determine which features of language ability it will be most useful for the user to know about when making decision. In assessing achievement, The focus will be on what has been taught. In assessing proficiency, it will be on the features that are essential in the real world situations where the assessees will be expected to use the language. The users come to choose a language abilities they need in order to make reasonable decisions. Maps must be regularly updated and improved to take account of changes in the landscape, new technologies, and the changing needs of travelers. Similarly, we must constantly review and revise assessment to ensure that they continue to give us the right information. The work of validation never ends. Beneficial consequences. Although maps might appear simply to be neutral decisions of territory, they are much more than that. They can be powerful tools for control and explanation. Some of the easiest known maps were used to plan military campaigns, fixed and ownership, and decided how much tax citizens should pay. Lines and pictures drawn on maps can become new roads, cities, boundaries, and barriers with dramatic transformative effects on the landscape and on people's lives. It has long been recognized that language assessment can also have powerful effects or impacts upon the knowledge, skills, and abilities they are intended to describe or measure. On individual, especially assessees, and on society. More generally, assessment can be like changing. They are used in deciding who should have access to important opportunities in areas such as immigration, further education, and employment. They can serve as relatively straightforward gateways to new prospects for some people and stand as impretendable impre standard as impenetrable walls keeping others excluded. Assessment promise a fairer way of making decision than the system of patronage and nepotism that they replace, but their apparent neutrality can mask continuing injustice. The content, format, and administration of assessment can work systematically in a favor of one group of assessees and giant another against another rather. The people who administer assessment and make decisions based on assessment results generally have the official status that give them power over the assessees, and it may not be easy to hold them to account if an assessment is unfair or has been poorly administered. A truly useful assessment is one that has more benefits than drawbacks for everyone involved. Washback. One area of impact of impact that is of particular concern to teachers is known as washback. Washback connects the design and use of an assessment with what teachers and learners do in the classroom, often preparing for the assessment. It is often claimed that high stakes tests in particular have a detrimental effect on learning as teachers focus their efforts on the content of the tests are at the expense of skills that are not tested. Figure 4.4 set out how watchback is believed to come about. First, the way in which learners respond to an assessment has a good deal to do with the design of the assessment and the content that is covers. In preparing for an assessment, teachers and learners would naturally be expected to focus on the knowledge, skills, or abilities that they believe that assessment deals with and give less attention to those that do not seems to be included. In a well-designed instructional program, consideration is given to the relationship between what learners are intended to learn and the content of the assessment. The overlap shown in figure 4.4 is closely like to face validity. See above. As it refers the point of view of the teacher and learners preparing for the test. Their perception of what is being assessed. This influences the watchback decision, which may be seen as positive or negative. If an assessment validly measures the range of abilities that towards that that ano, if an assessment validly measures the range of abilities that towards that assessment because learning of the assessment will also be positive. If the assessment appears to cover only a limited amount of content, construct under representation or if it assess abilities that are not included on the planned curriculum. Teachers may stop teaching important aspect of that curriculum in order to concentrate on the features that they believe are assess the direction of washback will be negative. Historically, arguments about washback have been most intense when there have been disagreement about the nature of language ability and effective language teaching. Groups arguing of radical new approach come into conflict with assessment that are based on speaking skill. For example, but old test is still used and it does not include a competent assessing speaking. Teachers feel under pressure from students and their parents to get good results on their tests and so focus on the skills that are tested rather than on the speaking skills mandated in the new curriculum. The solution, it has been argued, would be to bring in thus includes a speaking component. This would encourage teachers teach according to the new approach. More recently, research has highlighted a serious flaw in this line of argument. Teacher or learner's behavior are not as easy to manipulate as in suggests. First, people may not be fully aware of the changes made, may not be sympathetic to the changes and may resist them. A traditional teacher may not believe that is possible or desirable to teach speaking skills and may avoid making any changes to her practices. Her colleagues may want to teach speaking but lack manage speaking activities is in the classroom. The research into washback suggests that teachers tend to pay close attention to the format of a test. Rather than considering the underlying construct, the knowledge, skill, or abilities targeted by the assessment, just focusing on practice with the test format might not really help test spoken interview assessment based on personal information intended to assess impromptu conversation skills might. In practice, encouragement, memorization, or formula exchanges of short, memorized speech on abuse topics. Even though this may be of rather limited value outside or even inside the examination room, not every learner has the same access to preparation resources. Textbooks, sample papers, computers, and tutors. Individuals have their own ideas about what might be effective way of learning of achieving success. They may or may not be persuaded by advice from testing organization, teachers, textbook writers, and others. Washback will be powerful where all the all these stakeholders in the educational system share the same beliefs about effective tests, preparation, and work together to achieve it. In practice, washback tends to be highly variable. Washback variability in figure 4.4. Within a single class, one learner may radically change her language learning behaviors to prepare for tests, while another makes no chances to all at all to this. The variability in the way that people respond to an assessment is likely to their perception of the importance and the level of changes that the assessment represents. This factor influences the washback intensity that each individual experiences. Washback will not be intense. Learners are not likely to change the way in which they learn in order to prepare for the assessment. If doing well doesn't really matter to them, this could be because they think success is likely to be embarrassing easy, or on the other hand because they think they stand no chance on getting a good score. Washback is likely to be more intense if learners do value success and think that achieving it is challenging but realistic. In these circumstances, learners are likely to do whatever they can to prepare for the assessment. They might to change their study methods. To limit the intensity of the washback from any single assessment, so that no one assessment comes to dominate teaching and learning, it may be wise for test users to base decisions on as wide a range of evidence as possible and make it very clearly to the test takers that this is their policy. The strategy for improving validity advocated by relevant to washback, as it means that learners and teachers cannot foresee what is likely to be assessed and so concentrate their efforts on learning only that relatively narrow area of content. All assessments have consequence of at least one person. The impact is unlikely to be really beneficial units. The assessment is practical, reliable, and valid. If the information gained from flowing from it will be damaging. That is not to say that beneficial potential benefits will only be fully released if all participants in the educational system work together. Feedback. While washback from tests can have a powerful effect on the behavior of teachers and learners, the consequences of formative classroom-based procedure are more immediate and potentially more far-reaching. Such assessment must, of course, have practicality, reliability, and validity, the source and users. Usually, the teachers and learners themselves need a clear and accurate picture of what it is what learners are or are not able to do. This will not be possible unless the task and questioning techniques they use are a good quality. However, understanding something about the learner knowledge, skills, or abilities, correctly inferring what they can or cannot do, is not enough. To be useful, the insights obtained through formative assessment procedures must inform effective action. The main priority of formative promotes learning. Formative assessment is therefore the provision of feedback that encourage and promotes learning. Feedback is a metaphor based on systems engineering. It involves using information about the current stage of a system to regulate and make adjustment to the system. The ancient technology of water clocks exploits the concept. Water passes through a gap of a fixed size at a constant rate, and this fact can be used to tell the time. If water drips through a hole in the bottom of one bowl into a second bowl, the amount of water collected from shown how much time has passed. However, if the level of water is in the top bowl goes up or down, the drips will flow at different speed and the clock will become inaccurate. For the clock to work well, the water in the top bowl must be kept at a constant level. One way to solve the problem would be to employ a person to watch the system and add water when needed. But what would be very inefficient? Inefficient. Instead, our ancestors work out an ano ko? Our way to solve the problem would be to employ a person to watch the system and add water when needed. But that wouldn't be very inefficient. Instead, our ancestors work out an ingenious alternative. They put a float into the top bowl. If the top bowl is filled with water, the float rises and blocks the intent pipe. As the water level falls because of the dripping water, the float sinks down and the inlet pipe is unblocked rather, letting water through to fill the bowl. In this way, the water level is half contrast. The system regularities itself because information about the current state of the system is used feedback to change the state of the system, to open or close the inlet pipe as necessary. In a similar way, accurate information about current performance in the classroom obtained through assessment can be fed back to the teacher and learners. If learning is found in the proceeding smoothly, the class carried out on the plan. If the assessment reveals that all is not going well, carefully chosen feedback can be used to trigger modification that will keep learning moving forward efficiently. Repeating, practicing, or revising is if necessary. Exploring and extending where opportunities arise. Less time is wasted because learners are not left to struggle with material they do not understand and are not held up by studying material that is already known. If no information is obtained, or if the information is of poor quality, feedback cannot be effective. The information that teachers look for and the amount and kinds of feedbacks they can open to their students to help them improve their performance will depend in large measures of their beliefs about language learning. What they expect as evidence that learning has occurred and what they believe are the steps acquired to help students to make progress. The validity of a formative assessment approach is therefore closely tied to the theories of learning that support it. William provide compelling evidence for the power of well-conceived feedback given to learners of all ages of improve learning generally and to narrow the performance gap between the higher achieving and lower achieving learners. However, he also cautioned that simply providing feedback give no guarantee that beneficial consequences will follow and observe that some forms of feedback have actually been found to be counterproductive. The failure of much of the feedback given by teachers to foster better learning many have a variety of causes. Wiggins 1998 suggested that students can often find the feedback they are given uniformative. It level it leaves them feeling that they know that they are close to or far from the goal, but they don't know what or where the goals is. It does not convey to the learners that better performance would look like or what they need to change in their performance would look like or what they need to change in their current performance improve it. On the other hand, when when potentially useful feedback is provided, it is often ignored by learners because it is provided at the wrong time. After the work has been completed, it has been observed that as soon as grades are awarded, many learners tend to ignore the teacher's comment and so fail to benefit from the feedback they provide. Table 4.4 lays out some of the features that have been found to characterize more and less effective feedback strategies. Effective feedback is given at a point when it can be used by learners. This means that learners should be given opportunities to improve their performance on the basis of the feedback. Feedback is more likely to promote learning if the learners are challenged to think about ways in which their works has been successful in communicating their intended message and ways in which it has not been successful. They should then be able to use the insights gains through feedback to try against or to revise what they have produced. This is one reason why advocates of assessment of learning suggest that the awards of grades, which signals that is piece of works is finished, should be delayed for as long as possible and be open to modification through remedial work. Another reason is that instead of encouraging greater efforts, consistently low grades can cause students to feel that they are poor learners and lose motivation, while consistently high grades can encourage complacency and also lead to a reduction of effort. What Hill and McNamara term person reference feedback, praise or criticism of learners is not considered particularly valuable because it is informative about how performance should be modified to make it better. It is much more helpful to other tasks reference feedback that is concerned with the equalities of the learner's work. Brevity is furrowed. One or two well chosen observation will work. Observation will be more likely to bring about productive reflection than a len- lengthy essay or lecture from the teacher on everything that could be improved. Feedback is more effective and the overall system of assessment more coherent if it can be demonstrated to relate to learning goals. In other words, it should be explanatory and corrective, making it as clear as possible to the learner how his or her work satisfies or fails to satisfy the criteria for competent performance and how it could be improved. Hill and McNamara feedback based on checklists more useful than simple grades of scores. Models of successful performance can also help learners to notice what is successful and unsuccessful about their own, although it should be made clear that models are not intended for direct imitation. Indeed, learners will be better placed to benefit from feedback if they can learn how to interpret the criteria and use them to assess the work of other learners and eventually to assess their own works. Teachers as well as learners can benefit from receiving feedback. If a class is struggling to understand a very concept, the teacher need to know this so that he or she can provide more scaffold, scaffolding support that helps the learners to understand how to complete a task or find other way to convey the ideas. When learners are already familiar with whatever is being taught, the teacher may be able to move quickly through the unit or bring in some more challenging material. If if such issues are only picked up during an end of unit test, it may be too late to take action. Frequent informal assessment activities keep teachers in touch with how well how learners are able to assimilate new information and help to highlight where any difficulties lie. Summary: the right tool of the job. As tools, language assessment are closer in nature to maps than to tape measures, although they may differ in their precision and in the units they employ. All tape measures are designed to measure length. In contrast, maps represent the different aspect of a multi-dimensional words according to the needs of the user. Like maps, language assessment do not and should not all measures and represent the same thing. The choice of assessment technique should reflect the kind of decision that users wish to make and the kind of consequences that they hope will follow. The four quality frameworks of practicality. reliability, validity, and beneficial consequence informs design and help users to apply the price principle, taking full accounts of the intended purpose for assessment. Just as there is no perform map, no assessment can fully satisfy all four essential qualities. Ultimately, users must be satisfied that an assessment is justifiable justifiable as use of resources because it is better basis for decisions and leads to better consequences than the alternatives. At the same time, everyone involved should strive to improve on current practice.